I'm in the North York Moors. It's a day of sunshine and showers. And very open landscape with lots of fascinating distant detail. I have the 150 to 600 on the camera, which is a great lens for picking out distant details and juxtaposing things that are often quite far apart in space. I think landscape photographers do love to use long lenses, but it seems a curious sort of thought from the outside, at least, that people only ever shoot landscapes with wide-angle lenses, but that's absolutely not the case. And the longer perspective is often really effective for landscape photography. This location works well for telephotos because what's happening in the distance is the hillsides are a mixture of grazing and trees and open heather moorland, which creates wonderful texture and pattern. And the long lens allows me to position myself, move around, change the shape of the subject in relation to another, so the trees in particular, which are very much the focal point. And that makes it a really interesting way of exploring those elements of the landscape. At the moment, as I'm looking at the scene, it's really flat because it's overcast and the sun is behind clouds throughout the scene. But every so often, the cloud opens up, and when it does so, these amazing shafts of strong sunlight coming through, and they really animate the hillsides, create strong shadows and interesting highlights, and that light and shade really just brings it to life. Yeah, the composition is arranged so that the sky occupies a fairly small strip at the top, and that relates in proportion terms to the way that I've used the understory, the heather, the burnt back heather at the bottom. They occupy approximately 10 to 15% of the image area, top and bottom, and they have a proportionate relationship to one another. Most of the visual action is in the middle, and the kind of key participants on this landscape stage are the trees. And the trees are arranged in a way that creates rhythm and relationship. The shapes are equivalent, mostly full kind of canopy, individual trees that stand sometimes close together, but some of them are quite isolated as well. And it just makes something that has beauty and depth to me. And there's one very specific compromise in this composition, because in order to keep the camera low on a windy day and therefore avoid vibration, I've found that one of the tree canopies just come up against the wall that's several hundred meters beyond it. I don't think it matters that much, but who knows, when I get back and look at it on a computer I might change my mind. But because it's so windy, using a lens of this focal length, it makes sense to manage the technical side of it. I do need to keep the camera low. Yeah, it's a really interesting thought when you compare the different types of lenses you can use, zooms or prime telephoto lenses. And these days, zoom lenses actually dominate the field. There's no doubt that there's a huge range, and they're all really good optically, especially these Sigmas, I must say. But there is something appealing about using a prime lens as well, partly because the prime lenses that are available tend to be significantly faster than the zooms, and they're optically close to perfection, which is also appealing. Having said all of that, zooms are terrific. They allow you to frame the scene very accurately, and you can pick your spot where it creates the right perspective, and then just zoom to crop exactly as you see the picture unfolding. So there are pros and cons with both types, and I enjoy using both. We are right in the heart of the North York Moors in a little valley between Hornby and Osmotherley. Well, I think what we're going to do is wander in here and see what we can see. We're going to go up to the left of the end of the bridge. Just each step you take, things change constantly. So what makes this wood particularly good is the steep, it's only small space, but the river valley is really, really steep, and it gives a dark background on the east facing slope. So the trees where they freestand, like here, they emerge from the darkness, and that makes a really interesting lighting proposition. So that's a potential photograph there, and the ferns just defined against the shadow at the bottom works really well. However, I think I'd like to continue a bit further on. It's worth saying perhaps that this is really wildwood. Sometimes you come across old mine sites and it's really dramatic, but for the most part the trees have been growing ever since then. So there's many trees which are of a similar age because they've just been allowed to develop, and now you don't get so many young saplings because they tend to get nibbled down by the deer. As we go by, you can see there's quite a variety of different types of trees, but the predominant species are oak and birch, and there's a beautiful silver birch here, now no longer alive. Lots of character, isn't quite in the right place for a photo, but that's the sort of thing that I always enjoy seeing. You can see it's lost, it's the upper part of it, it's lying on the ground here. So that's another aspect of the wood that shows you it's wild, because it's not been tidied up. You know, everything's been allowed to decay, to rot back naturally, and it contributes to this atmosphere of chaotic, you know, almost semi-wilderness. See, there's another composition right here with this, again, really old birch, probably a similar age to the previous one, with its bifurcating trunk, I think they're called. And because it's light, it comes forward in space against the dark background, and then it's framed by the oaks behind it. We'll keep moving. Honestly, this is such an amazing place. You walk along here and it's like walking along an art gallery. You know, every so often you stop and there's a picture. Obviously you need the right conditions. At the moment it's dry, has been raining earlier today. So everything's slightly damp, the light's really soft, and that's wonderful for woods. And the reason it's wonderful is that woodland is very, very high contrast. So when you have sunlight, that makes the contrast, just super accelerates the contrast, makes it worse, harder photographically, whereas a soft light allows the light and shade balance to be good. You can see all the texture and colour, and yeah, it's all a thing of beauty. Challenging this time of year, late spring, everything's very green, but the ferns are at their peak as well, so that's a lovely detail. The river's not flowing too strongly, but it's lovely to hear the sound of the river in the background as well. It's very, very peaceful place, very inspiring. There's a very beautiful tree here that's lost its life but still has lots of expressive life in its shape. And there's a composition that could be shot relatively wide, but what I'm really interested to try here at the moment and in this light is to use a longer lens and isolate it against the background. And that's really the idea of the photograph. We used a long lens to isolate the shape of the tree against the background, which the background itself is quite a texture. In essence, this is a portrait of a tree, of this dead tree, but as an abstraction, it's a study in line. So it's a single line moving through space that then splits at the top in what would have been a canopy. And I suppose that from a kind of aesthetic stroke creative point of idea, at least, it's a it's a study in energy and the remnant energy of a tree. The background is very important because it frames and essentially it forms just that, the background to the line, but it's rich in texture, and it also tells us something about the woodland environment. From almost exactly the same spot, just a tiny bit further forward, I've switched to the 85 f1.4 art, and the beauty of this is that I can frame that lovely tree in almost the same way, but now I have a whole left-hand side horizontal, but again, very fast lens, so I have the opportunity to try using drop focus to see how that's going to work. And because I always find it easier to judge those sorts of end results on screen on a computer, I will actually experiment and try a number of different apertures, including f1.4 wide open. So the f11 one, that was the last one I've shot. Here you can see it's good exposure. If I go into 100%, jump into 100%, and just start off on our main tree on the right hand side, super sharp, but you can see now that the leaves behind above the river are quite crisp at f11. If we come across to the birch on the left hand side, which occupies quite a bit of the image area, it's falling off, it's softer, but there's lots and lots of actually very usable detail into, at least at normal print sizes. I mean, 100%, that's a huge amount of enlargement. So that's one way of making this work, I think. In essence, the emphasis is still on the right-hand tree, but now there's a sort of geographic record quality about it. But if we were to go to the f1.4 version, and actually you can't really see any vignetting or anything either. And again, if we start off at the right-hand tree, you can see now that the leaves in the background are really quite soft beyond the river. And then as we scroll across, there's one tree that's on the same plane, just sort of partially hidden there behind those leaves, same plane as the right-hand tree. And then we come across to the big birch, and now it's just a blur of light and dark going up and down it. So who knows whether that will work in the final composition, but it gives a very different emphasis. This is Sutton Bank, which is widely regarded as the greatest view in England, or at least it was by James Herriot, the writer. And I think most people in North Yorkshire would agree. It is an absolutely fantastic view. It's a huge, wide vista, so you might imagine that a wide-angle lens would be the right lens, but actually it's a great place to shoot with a really long lens because of the wealth of detail, which actually is also a long way away. And the beauty of using the 150 to 600 is that you can pick out these shapes and patterns that you wouldn't otherwise perhaps be able to emphasize so well. Certainly you wouldn't with a wider lens, or indeed with your own eyes. So yeah, you can see more with this type of lens than you normally ever would. And I've just been able to sit down and look around and pick out different cameos, vignettes from within the wider landscape. And I've found two or three that I really, really like. So really the most important thing is to concentrate on one picture at a time, one composition, and wait for the light to get that lovely dappled light which conveys a feeling of depth. I think the most important thing really is the sense of design and pattern here. The great photography critic John Sharkowski said that the edges of the frame are like the cushion of a billiard table, and you're trying to keep the energy bouncing around inside. So this is a perfect place to exercise that idea, because the walls or the hedges of the field divisions come up as the corners very often against the edge of the frame, and you can use them as sort of diamond patterns within the frame. And that's one of the ideas I'm working with compositionally. So the composition is designed around the farmhouse in the bottom left, and then I think it draws across to the right hand side of the frame and then comes back again, and that's really the idea, is these sort of intersecting shapes through the space. In my favorite versions, there's a little bit of dappled lighting which works really nicely. It darkens everything down, creates some mood, and it also means that some trees are then lit against dark. So you get that feeling of space and depth. And in the far distance, there's a ridge, and the ridge has fields on, but also an area of woodland that defines its edge, and then beyond that you can just get a glimpse of the distant landscape. So all lenses are landscape lenses, really, from super wide through wide, standard lenses, short telephoto, long zoom lenses. They can all work great to compose a landscape. I think one thing I'd love to say, though, in summary, is that especially with the telephoto lens and the long zooms, is that in many ways it reflects the way that our brains work when we look around us at the world, and we often find ourselves looking into the distance thinking how beautiful or amazing and interesting it is. If you take a normal photo of that with your phone, for example, it diminishes it. The long lens draws it in, it magnifies the scene, and it makes it how we imagine it to be. And in that sense, it's a really powerful tool in our optical armory.